Age Well Expo. I'm Natalie Mathewson. I work for Central Minnesota Council on Aging with Community Development, but I'm also part of the Chisago Age Well Coalition Board. So we are so excited to have everyone here today for our, what are we on, our 5th or 6th year with the Age Well Expo? And the exciting thing is we are back to where we were the first few years before the pandemic. We have over 70 vendors today. But I'm here to briefly introduce our presenter, and I've been fortunate to work with Dr. Steve Hoover the last several years with the Council on Aging, and he does awesome presentations, one of which you are going to hear today, Flourishing in the Second Half of Life. Dr. Hoover is a retired St. Cloud State professor, but like many of us as we're retiring, I don't use that word much anymore because I don't think we ever just stop. We just do something different, and he's a true testament to that. So I'm not going to take any much more of your time or his time, and I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Hoover. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, I failed retirement 3 times now. So thank you all. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about this concept of flourishing in the second half of life. So I was trained as a psychologist. I did not do clinical psychology. And one of the reasons was the emphasis on what's wrong with us, which is essentially what clinical psychology addresses. So in the late 1990s, there was a movement toward what has come to be called positive psychology, which doesn't ask the question, what's wrong with us and what can we do about it? It asks what's right with us. What are our strengths? What are our character strengths? And what are the things we do in order to promote flourishing? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'll move along quickly because this is a session sometimes that I may take several hours or a couple hours to do or a whole day workshop. So I'm going to hit the highlights for you today. I will be available afterwards out at a table out here if you've got questions. I don't know if I'll have time today during our session to ask questions. So one of the things that I think is so important, and I was a university teacher, I was a public school teacher for a number of years too, is that it's important for when we're trying to engage material, especially as we get older. One of the things we need to do is we need to set an intention for what we want to take away from a particular session. So I found this is really good. I know as a teacher I used to tell kids to pay attention. We never taught them how to pay attention. So one of the ways we did that is, and this is some work came out of Harvard, Ellen Langer, talked about mindful abstractions. And it's a very simple concept, is to ask people as they're sitting there, what do you want to get out of today? What is it you would like to take away from today? And so to think about what is my intention here in attending this, coming in here to learn maybe a little bit about flourishing. So the idea is to set an intention which helps facilitate attention, and we also find that it helps to facilitate recall. So think for a second, why are you in here? What is it you want to get out of this? What are you like to carry away from the session in here today? And then I'm going to give you a very simple plan, and I really like this simple plan. This was somebody that was in a session one time and came away with these 4 little things to think about. And I like this because one of the things I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you some ideas about some things that you could start doing that enhances flourishing in our lives. So one of them is, what is something based on today that I could start doing? What is something I could start doing that I might not be doing right now? And so there would be maybe one thing that you list out of today to say, oh, I could start doing that. Or there may be some things that you're not doing, or you're doing that you should stop doing, or maybe do less of based on that. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not going to have a lot of the don'ts here today. Most of what I'm going to do is the more positive perspective of things that we ought to be doing. And then, because we all do a lot of these things, is to recognize the fact that many of us are already doing some really good things in our lives that promote flourishing for us and others. So what are some things that I want to either continue or maybe do more of and expand on that? And then I added this last one because sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, I go to a session or I hear somebody present or I read something and it piques my interest, but I'm not quite sure about it. So I may want to look into it a little more. I may want to find out a little bit more about it. I might want to do some research. So the last one is to explore it a little bit, maybe to learn a little bit more about what we're talking about. So mentioned positive psychology. A number of years ago, 1999, I attended a conference at Gallup Institute in Washington, D.C. So Positive psychology was just getting going. I had read a lot of the materials on it. I had heard about all the people that were presenting in positive psychology, and they were going to be at this first national conference in Washington, D.C. And so I went to hear what they were talking about. I was really excited about it. I was very disappointed because all these luminaries in the field, all they did was talk about what they'd already written. So I wasn't getting anything new, but it was a graduate student, just a lowly graduate student. I was just out of college, or graduate school at the time. And he presented the topic on his research was, how many of you have come home from work or whatever? It will happen to me when I come home today, and my wife will say, how was your day? You know, how did it go? Now, I always throw that last piece on there because if it's, how was your day, and no dear, I know I'm in trouble. So it was, how was your day, dear? Then I know that it's okay. I can start talking about it. But when he said that, I thought, well, it's kind of interesting because we've all had that experience. It's kind of like kids. What'd you learn in school today? And the answer is nothing. So what he found was there were 4 answers to this question in general. This was a qualitative study. And the first 3 were the most common responses people gave for, how was your day, dear? The first one was, I survived. Okay, and we've all had those kinds of days where it's going and we just can't wait to get home, relax, turn on television, have an adult beverage. We survived. We're just gotten through the day and we're happy to have done so. Not a lot, but a number of them were there. The second one was, I was busy. I had things going on. So when I was in college, I worked part-time at a bank. I was a teller. And I hated Monday through Thursdays. Now, this is the olden days when people would get paid and they'd bring their checks in. I loved Fridays because we were very, very busy and the day went fast. The worst thing was those boredom days where there's nothing going on. So I liked the days where I was busy. It was more positive than I survived. And then the third one of the most common was, I was productive. I think of I was productive. How many of you are list makers? Yeah, it's very good. I used to teach stress management. One of the things I would tell my students is one way to deal with stress when they're looking at all the things they've got going is to make a list, okay? And if it's really overwhelming, sometimes you need to be very, very specific. This Monday morning, this is it, and go down there. But you know what the first thing you put on your to-do list is? Make a to-do list. Because you get to cross that one off right away. And there's so much motivation to start crossing things off your list. So I think about people saying, I was productive. They got a lot of things done on their to-do list. Now, these were the most common of these. But it was the fourth one that he found was the most interesting group. It was smaller. It was only about 10 to 20% of the respondents said, I'm not talking and I'm not clicking. All right, so we'll step over here and do this, see if this works. I was productive. Talk about anticlimactic. I was productive. But what it was really interesting when he did research on these individuals. Those that came home at the end of the day and said, I made a difference. They were happier. They were more positive. They had higher scores on Flourishing. They tended to be those who were actually higher quality of life. But as I'll come to in a minute, and I'm tying back to what I said before, one of the big differences between the 4, because when he would interview individuals in the first 3 groups, found that, yeah, when they think back on it, they had some moments where they may have made a difference in somebody's life. But more importantly, they also realized they'd missed opportunities. So if you think about going through your to-do list, and I've done this before, I'm so certain of getting all my things done that I can't be there for anybody else because I got to get all these things done on my to-do list. And so what he found was that this last group, the reason they were able to make a difference and they were able to do this is they made an intention every day when they got up to find some way to make a difference in somebody's life. Whether it was major or minor, it was making a difference in people's lives. So this is the first thing I want to suggest on your to-do list, so to speak, from the things that I've talked about, is to set an intention and to do what I call the Daily Difference Initiative. Every day, set an intention at the beginning of the day. So I would do this with students, and they'd use Post-its or whatever, things on their phone, to remind them to make a difference every day. And then look for those opportunities. It could be small opportunities. It doesn't have to be earth-shattering kinds of things. It can be minor things, opening a door, smiling at somebody. I had a student one time that he was at risk for suicide, and he said the day that he was really seriously considering suicide, he went out and he said, if somebody smiles at me today, I won't kill myself. And somebody did. And that was all it took. He just wanted somebody to smile at him that day. So those small things, meaningful things in their lives. And then reflect daily on those opportunities, because making a difference for others also makes a difference for who? It makes a difference for us. There's a theory of psychology called elevation. In other words, you see somebody doing something morally good, and it elevates you in the sense that you want to do that. Well, we can do that to ourselves. We can also elevate ourselves morally and ethically. So every day, there's your first thing on this, is to set an intention to make a difference. Okay, so what are we talking specifically about today is this concept of flourishing. And I need to characterize it as contrasting it with two other states. So Corey Keyes, who's done the major research on this and actually has just recently, in March, had a new book come out on this concept, he's very concerned about this last category at the bottom, and that's depression. And yes, a number of people are clinically, and I use that word specifically, clinically depressed. But the clinical depression rates are much lower than the people who are prescribed medication for depression. And what he found in looking at this is there were a lot of people who were prescribed medication for depression, because that's an easy thing to do. I've got a friend who's a doctor. He says if somebody's, it's easy for me to write a prescription for them. They're not depressed, they're what we call languishing. In other words, they lack meaning, they lack purpose. This is going to be the key part. I see this, so Natalie was talking about my failed retirements. I see this in a lot of people who retire, who've had years and years of doing things that made differences, and all of a sudden they're just done. And so I talk about retirement planning, financial, yes, but more importantly, what are you going to do to provide meaning and purpose as you enter into those years where you've got a lot of opportunities to do so. So we're going to talk a little bit about flourishing in the contrast between that and languishing. So languishing is that state of just kind of floating, not really knowing what you're going to do, not really having purpose and meaning. So there's a lot on this slide, and the only part of this I really want to hit, although there are the first two. One, languishing is a psychological state in which a person feels emptiness, stagnation, a little despair, importantly lacking meaning and purpose in their lives. They're just floating. They're not quite sure. Now, that's not always bad. Sometimes we call transitional stage between two things is an opportunity to see what do I want to do next. But it's that ongoing, simply going through the motions and out of touch with my essential character, and I'm going to talk at the end about our strengths and values, which is really, really important, is understanding what our strengths are. So Corey Keyes puts it this way: even if we could find a cure for mental illness tomorrow, it does not mean that most people would necessarily be flourishing in life. In other words, we cannot treat our way out of the problems of mental illness. We must also promote a life of balance in which people can achieve happiness and realize lives in which they flourish. So I have to keep coming back over here because my clicker's not working. So flourishing, what is it specifically other than just talking about flourishing? It's the product of a pursuit and engagement of an authentic life that brings inner joy, happiness, meeting goals, being connected with your passions in life, and relishing in your accomplishments through both the peaks and valleys of life. And so we're going to take a little while here in a few minutes to go through the specific types of flourishing, and that's where I want you to think about rating yourself, if you will, on how am I doing on a flourishing life. But one of the things that, having been researcher myself, I want to know, does it actually make a difference? And so there's a laundry list, and I've highlighted just a few of these, that people who are leading a flourishing life, scoring higher on measures of flourishing, tend to have lower healthcare utilization, fewer days where they have limited access to their activities. Chronic physical diseases with aging are reduced. In other words, a whole number of things that show the positive benefits of having and engaging in a flourishing life. So, we'll jump right in. There's a model called PERMA, which is the model of flourishing that Martin Seligman, who is the father of positive psychology, which there's a whole story behind Martin Seligman. His initial research was on something called learned helplessness, which is about the farthest from positive psychology we can get. And he was, at one point, remarried, had a young child. She was, I think, 6 or 7 at the time, as tells the story. And it was an epiphany for him because Martin Seligman had 2 big passions in his life. One was gardening. He's at the University of Pennsylvania now. People in psychology know of Martin Seligman. Gardening and playing bridge. So he was out one day gardening, and Martin Seligman is about as anal retentive as you can get, if you know what that means. Everything has to be in lines and rows, and everything has to be done just his way. So he was out there with his new young daughter, and he was weeding. Well, she was out there to help him. And so what she was doing is she'd find a weed, and she'd pull it, and she'd toss it into the air over toward the bag that he was supposed to go in, and then she'd go over here, find another weed, and of course, Martin Seligman is going down this row, one at a time, with the bag next to him, all the way down, all the way back. She's running around doing this, and he's yelling at her that she's not doing it right. And so at one point, she comes over, and she says, "Dad, when I was younger, I was a grump too. And I realized that I didn't want to go through life like that." And so she went back to, and he said, "I sat in my garden for an hour thinking about what I was modeling for my daughter in this." And that was the epiphany he had for the movement toward positive psychology. That there has to be ways that we can help people enrich and enjoy and do things that are more positive in their lives. So one of the hallmarks of positive psychology is this discussion about positive emotions. How many of you have watched the news a lot lately? Get wrapped up in all the news and all the different sources and all that stuff, and you need to turn that shit off. Why? Well, fear sells. Fear sells. We are hardwired to respond more to fear, threats. That's who we are. Do you remember Tiny Tim? Tiptoe through the tulips. Do you remember him? That kind of going through life like Martin Seligman's little daughter, flipping the things. Well, that's great when we're living as we are now, but if we're back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, you go through life like that, you're going to get eaten. You're going to get killed. So we actually have evolved a need to respond to threats in our environment. So the negative is much stronger in our responses than the positive. However, the downside of that is it has costs for us. Stress, chronic stress, heart disease, etc. So what they have found in the field of positive psychology is to contrast those negative emotions, fear, anger, disgust, sadness, rage, loneliness, melancholy, annoyance, with the positive emotions. So I want you to take a second and just think. When was the last time you experienced joy? When was the last time you experienced contentment, amusement, serenity? Or my favorite is awe. The last time you experienced awe. I was coming on my way over here, and of course it's a beautiful day. It's a long drive from St. Cloud, but it's a beautiful day, and just as the sun was coming up, it's coming over a lake, at that time. And that sense of awe, when you just see that, is amazing, and it just startles you, it just catches you. So one of the things that Barbara Fredrickson has found is that flourishing individuals, psychologically healthy individuals, have a ratio of at least 3 positive emotional reactions to every 1 negative emotional reaction. Now, I was doing this presentation with a group of individuals at the prison in St. Cloud, and they were going, "Well, we don't have a whole lot of those positive emotional things out here." And I said, "Well, are there any times when you feel at least contentment in there? Are there times when you feel satisfaction with something? And they said, yes. And I said, focus on those and reduce the amount of time that you focus on the others. So I'll give you an example here. My mom, she passed away in 22 in December. She was 96. And she was a news junkie, but she, more importantly, had the TV on a lot of times just for background noise. Every year, it's coming up about that time, around the holidays, the ASPCA starts their commercials. Do you know what I'm talking about here? Yeah, those animals. We used to have dogs. Well, I still have dogs. We've got 2 puppies. I'm 70 years old. Getting 2 puppies is either stupid or optimistic, and I'm not sure yet which one it is. But she loves dogs, and of course there's those commercials. And so I'm over there, I took care of her finances and help and everything. And she says, write a check to the ASPCA. And I said, Mama, hang on for just a second here. Let's take a look at how much it's actually going to get to the dogs. And if you're familiar with that kind of fundraising, which they need to do a lot of, there's cost, et cetera, et cetera. So now she was depressed. I made her further angry, not just scared and angry, but she was depressed. And she said, so what do? Well, I would get her groceries every week for her. And I said, what I'll do is when I get your groceries, I'll buy a bag of dog food and I'll drop it off at the Tri-County Humane Society. Oh, she was so happy with that. So she was telling her sister to buy dog food and take it to the Tri-County Humane Society because she was able now to make a difference and to focus more on those positive than the negative emotions that was going on. So the question here is, how often in your day are you feeling those negative emotions versus those positive emotions? And what we find is that we can control that. We can focus on more of those things that give us joy and awe and contentment. So positive emotions is the P in this model. How often do I engage in the positive emotions? The other one, the E, is a broad category, this is the PERMA model, is the broad category of engagement. So positive social engagement. So we created, when I first started the Council on Aging, the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness. Now, we know now about how the impact of that, it was in our face during the pandemic. And I know my mom was impacted by that because she couldn't go out. She wasn't in a facility, but she couldn't leave her home during that time period because of her susceptibility to infections. So one of the things we found is that all of that research that talked about how bad social isolation and loneliness was not new. This has been talked about among researchers for over 20 years. But now it was in our face on the news. We now saw the impact of social isolation and loneliness. So we know the necessarily problematic aspects of social engagement. So one of the things we talk about is what are the opposites and the things we can do with regard to social isolation and loneliness. And I just quickly put up a one figure that's out of that research, which suggests that severe social isolation and loneliness is the equivalent of smoking up to a half a pack of cigarettes a day. So clubs, organizations, coming to events such as this in St. Cloud, because I used to do a lot of work in men's research and study, we're not real good joiners sometimes. So one of the things we did is we created a men's shed in St. Cloud. And we get together, and I'll tell you about the birdhouse story in a little bit. But it's an opportunity for men to come together. Women are not excluded. It's not some club that says no girls allowed. But where we come together and talk about how can we stay active in doing things for the community. The impact on health is really important here. It's not the quantity of connections. And this is one of the things we're seeing among younger people. So social isolation and loneliness peaks at 2 periods in the lifestyle. One is early on in the early 20s. High school students experience it now. The other is later in life. What we find is that it's interesting, the students, and I worked with kids at St. Cloud Tech High School, the students have lots of quote-unquote friends, right? They've got them on here. But when I ask them the question, how many of those people you have on here would you turn to in a crisis? And what was their response? Almost none. And that's they have plenty of social, but they are still very lonely and isolated in that. So one of the things we talk about is how do we make the move from just a lot of activities to something that's meaningful and purposeful for you. This is too big, don't worry about the whole thing, but focus on 3 points here. So in our coalition to address social isolation and loneliness in St. Cloud, we focused on 3 things: the structure, the function, and the quality of social connections. All that means is, structure means the things you go to. So I have people that come to my Tai Chi class. They come there, turns out, for 2 big reasons. One is to prevent falls. Okay, that's the point of the class, is to prevent falls. Build some strength, not a lot, but some strength, prevent falls. That's a function. The second function isn't just the class, it's what? They come a little early, they stay after. It's all of those qualitative relationships that they experience. In other words, when we look at our social connections, we can ask ourselves, what are the structural things? In other words, what are the things that I'm going to? Could be church, could be hobbies, it could be any number of things, could be taking a class. But then to think very carefully about what function does it serve? And is the quality of it something that I want to have? So I had a client who was in an assisted living, and she was going to take a chair yoga class. And she set up to do that, and I came back the next week, and I said, how did it go? Are you going to do it again? She said, no, I'm not going back. And I said, well, why not? Did they not do the chair yoga? She said, oh, yeah, we did chair yoga for about 35, 40 minutes. That was the structure. And I said, well, how did it go? And she said, well, it was okay. I got to move, and I got to do that kind of stuff. So that meant one of the functions. But she said the instructor showed up right on time, and as soon as the class was or class was done, she left, and then everybody went back to their rooms. And she said, what I really wanted was an opportunity also to kind of talk to people and get together. So it was very sterile, is the word she used. It was there as a class. So when we talk about, and I do this we talk about the senior centers, providing activities, we need to be sure that we provide those activities. That's the structure. But we need to ask ourselves the question, what's the function and the quality? So if you look on here, marriage is on there, right? The first one and the last one. So I had somebody sitting in the audience one time and said, oh, so just because I'm married doesn't mean I'm not lonely, pointing to those. And I said, absolutely right. The quality of that relationship is key. It's not just that you meet those things. That's social isolation. That's am I engaging in activities? But it's the quality of those things that we often don't address really, really well. Okay, so the longest study, developmental study, in the United States and worldwide is the Harvard longitudinal study. It began way back in the 40s and 50s. John F. Kennedy. I use that name with us. It's okay. I would do that with my students, and they'd just look at me. Generational. So Kennedy was one of the subjects in this study. The Harvard longitudinal study was started back then in the 30s and 40s. It is still going on to this day. Recent book came last year called The Good Life. And it's a long study, a long that talks about the outcomes of that study. The author of the book boiled it down to one thing. He said, if there's one thing you do to make sure that you live a long, healthy life, it's to have a focus on relationships. The Harvard study revealed that the one highly significant factor in health and longevity was positive relationships. Positive relationships. And it wasn't, the quality was the key. It wasn't the quantity. It was, as I asked those high school students, do you have one person you can turn to? Somebody with whom you can have a good discussion when you're in crisis? And they said no. They didn't have one person, one good friend that they could turn to. So relationships are critical to this. So my wife and I we've been married for 48 years. And you get to a point in all this where you don't, anniversaries, we've got one coming up in a couple years, and I can't remember what 50 is. It's going to cost me a lot of money, that's all I know. But at that point, one of the things is we just do cards anymore. That's kind of all we do. We may go out to dinner or whatever, but we do cards. But we do cards differently. And I think this is really important, my psychology background. So the way this works is she gets me a card that reflects what she believes my view of the relationship is. So think about that for a second. And then I get her a card the same way about how I think she views the relationship. This is this year's. So this is what I got for her. This is how I believe she sees us. I don't ask her if I'm right. I don't want to know. Okay? Well, here's what she gave me. Now, last time I did this, about 3 weeks ago, somebody said, well, who's who in that? I'm not going to answer that question. But the point is that in the relationship, we're asking the question not, well, it's kind of that question about, is it good for you? No, don't go there. That idea of, is the relationship working for you? The quality of that relationship. So the goal, think about how different it is to think about that in a relationship, is to select a card that will reflect how the other person views the relationship, rather than what I want to give to her in that. And so we found that that's been kind of interesting. We had some really good conversations about that. Okay, meaning and purpose. So one of the things that we talk about with meaning and purpose is, what are your reasons for getting up in the morning? What gets you out of bed? What are you excited to do in the morning that gets you out of bed? Reasons for doing it. It can be the mundane things. It can be gardening. It doesn't have to be great things. It can be something that directs your attention, something that gets you moving in the morning, a reason to get up. Sometimes it is transcendent. And we found in the research on meaning and purpose that there were a lot of people that were doing things like volunteering because it was beyond themselves. It was making a difference. Notice that theme of making a difference is going to float throughout much of this. It's something beyond me. It's transcendent in that. And then, what are the things that give your life meaning and purpose? So I had somebody come up one time after a session, and she said, my husband worked for years. He worked for over 45 years, and he's retired. And when I get up and I go do I don't know what she was doing volunteer work, he's still in bed, and when I come home in the afternoon, he's sitting on the couch. And that's the extent of what he's doing. And he just seems to be, and she stopped for a second, and I said, kind of languishing, right? And that's what it was. She said, yeah, he's just floating. He doesn't have any meaning or purpose in this. And I'll be honest with you, the research shows that this is much more common among men in retirement than among women in retirement, for a variety of reasons. So asking the question, what can I do to engage? What are my accomplishments? So in that PERMA model, having achievements for which you're proud of. Now, in the work world, those achievements often end at the point that we retire. But that also gives us more time to look at things like hobbies or activities that allow us to engage in what researchers in positive psychology call flow. Flow is that idea that once you're engaged in it, you are so engaged in it that time is just not a factor. You don't notice people around you. So enjoying what you're doing that time is just, you're in the flow, you're in the zone, so to speak, on this. Things such as allow you to spend lose sense of time, and something that you want to learn more about to continue doing. Now, there's been an interesting addition just recently to this idea of the good life and meaning and purpose in life. So the first two areas we've talked about before are, what is the good life? One is happiness, and the second is meaning. I just mentioned meaning. Happiness is more often the positive emotions than the negative emotions. But one of the things that's come up, and I really like this, is, are you leading a psychologically interesting life? And all that means is, do you find things interesting? Do you notice in the sense of that positive awe? Are there things that I'd like to know more about that. That's interesting. Do you find those things interesting that you want to engage in more? And do you go out of the way to actually find those things? So one of the things that leads to is this idea of novelty. And one of the things that I like talking about, especially with older adults, and in part because I've got an 8-year-old grandson right now, is this idea of play. Now, there's structured play. Golf is structured play, right? It's Well, it isn't play for me, but it's structured play. But those times when you just do something for the sheer joy of it. Have you ever watched little kids playing and they make up the rules? Of course, they're always making up the rules so it benefits them. But they are just engaged in it. That's a positive sense of enjoyment that they're having. So I love this quote from George Bernard Shaw. We don't stop playing because we get old. We get old because we stop playing. And I think that is so true. We can play with ideas, we can actually do things, we can create, and that leads us to this idea of creativity. I think creativity is the one place that we have as seniors the opportunity to do things that we've never done before, unless it was part of our job. When I talk to people and I mention creativity, what's the one response I'll often get? I'm not a creative person. I understand that. So I'm listening to are any of the ukulele players in here? Okay, bless you. I can't do that. I have a daughter-in-law who is an elementary music teacher, and she gets so mad at me because I pick it up. I've got a ukulele, and I try to do it, and of course, what do I want? I want to be able to do it now. I don't want to work at it. It's kind of like I want to be a writer, but I don't want to do the work of writing. I just like the idea of it. So I can't do it, and that really pisses her off to no end with this idea that, yes, you can. So when we talk about creativity, many people have a mistaken notion of what creativity is. So let me take you through these 4 types of creativity, and I want you to ask yourselves the question, where do I fit in this? Because every one of us fits in here somewhere, and it builds part of our flourishing lives. So let me define them, because most often when I say creativity, people think of that last category of big creativity. But the reality is, creativity is much more than that. In fact, it's a lot more than that. So one of the things we do is we talk about mini creativity. And these are things that are unusual and personally meaningful for you. So for instance, I teach a course called Guided Autobiography. In fact, I'm going to be over here on election day, November 6th? 5th? 5th or 6th, one of those 2 days. It's a Tuesday, I think, this time. All right, so anyway, I'm over here talking about guided autobiography, about writing your life stories. But I don't talk about it as writing our life stories. I talk about it as recreating our life stories. We have the opportunity, and there's little prompts that we use to get you to think about it, and then they write their stories. They're short, 2-page, around a particular theme. One is called branching points. And it's the idea that in our lives, there are times when something happens and we go this way. Or we go this way. So I was an undergraduate student at Indiana University, and I was helping these young ladies who were coming in for a party. It was raining. I was carrying an umbrella, and I was helping them come in from the cars. And a little while later, this person taps me on the shoulder and asks the question, how many guys are in this particular fraternity? Now, I didn't live in the fraternity at the time. I lived off campus. I almost didn't go to the party. And we've been married for 48 years. So it's that little occurrence. Those fascinate me, those little things that happen. And so people in their first story, they write about some of the branching points in their lives, those things that have taken, and they create that story. That's creativity. I talk about this, and I have, well, the birdhouses, I'll tell you in a second. One of the things we did with the men's shed is that I had the guys, and we cut birdhouses so that we could put them together with elementary students. And what we did is we just cut the birdhouses and then helped the kids put them together. But some of the things the guys were doing to create novel designs in the birdhouses were extremely creative. You know, they're not going to make money on this, but they were very creative, and they were very satisfying to the guys, and the students, the little kids, loved it. So one of the things I also do, I have people share with me those little things that they do. I had a guy come up one time, and he makes journals. He just cuts the leather, he got paper, he sews them together, and he gives his family journals. I had a woman who is a fabric artist, and one of the things she does is she creates journals with this fabric material. I had another person who makes little rag dolls, and she donates them to the hospital for the pediatric wing. So the little kids have these dolls. That's what I consider that kind of mini creativity. The gardening, all those things. I've got a guy on order who has one of those little lathes, and he turns pens, Southwestern design pens on there. Again, he's not going to make money on it. It's not why he's doing it, but he loves the artistic nature of it. It's creativity. I've got another guy that's given me one of his walking canes. Are you familiar with diamond willow? It's a type of wood, and you can carve it, and it's really beautiful, and he's given me one of those. That's what he does. He makes these beautiful hiking sticks. That's creativity. That's that mini creativity, that little novel creativity. All right, then there is what we call little c. Little c is mini c that other people want. So I'm buying the guy's pen. It's $75, I'm buying the pen. I've bought one of the guy's journals. I bought one of the woman's journals from this. So it's the idea that somebody likes what you've got and they want it. My dad had an amazing chili recipe that people actually wanted once they tasted it. Journals, pens, not hot dish. I'm not from Minnesota. I don't know how long it took before I realized that hot dish isn't the same as casserole, that it had very specific. For us, hot dish was a casserole, just any hot dish you brought. No, it's capitalized out there. It's not lowercase. So I have a problem with hot dish. Anyway, or we get to Pro C. Pro C is where you make a living with this, being creative. My wife is a quilt designer. She goes on cruises where they do quilting on the cruises. She's very well known in this, but for her, this is now a job. This is a level of creativity that comes with a cost as well. She's got to be creative. She's got to think about. And one of the things we find is there's a real difference between those first two and down here with motivation. Up there, it's intrinsic motivation. You're doing it because you love it. Down here, all of a sudden, it's a job. And it changes the nature of it. And then I talk about some of the others. I come from a science background, which are big C. We know Einstein. We know Norman Borlaug, right? You should. How many of you, when little kids and you didn't finish your dinner, and your parents said, you know, there are children starving in India and China, right? And I slid my plate across and said, well, send it to them. Yeah, Martin Borlaug was at the University of Minnesota, agriculture. And what he did over a 15-year period is he developed something called dwarf wheat, the kind of wheat that could withstand the climates in India and China. He is credited with the fact that we don't hear about those kinds of starvations anymore. Remember when we'd see children in Ethiopia and India, they don't occur anymore, and primarily because of literally billions of people whose lives have been saved because of Martin Borlaug. He's a Minnesotan, by the way. And then, my favorite, though, is George DeMestral. Anybody heard of George? Yeah, I love George. Well, he's gone. But anyway, George was walking his dog one time, walking his dog in the woods, and when he came home, he noticed there were all these travelers, you know, little burrs on them, and he looked at them, and he thought, this is interesting. And what did he invent? Velcro. Now, why did I love this? Well, we got a thing from our first grade teacher when my youngest son was going to school. It was a letter, said, as of whatever the date was, they had to learn to tie their shoes, and they had to come with tied shoes, laced shoes. So figure, okay, it's time. We've gotten away from it because up until then, of course, they had those shoes that you just did the Velcro on, right? Made it a lot easier as parents, not having to teach them how to tie their shoes. So I thought, okay, it's part of the curriculum. And so we taught him how to tie the shoes. Then we had parent conference, and I was a teacher, so I was just kind of curious, when did they put that into the curriculum? And the teacher looked at me. She goes, it's not in the curriculum. She says, I got so sick of hearing those kids go whoosh, 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 with that I banned the Velcro shoes in the school, and I made them come only with tied or laced shoes. All right, so George was my hero. So we talk about flourishing, and I'm going to go into the last piece of this here very quickly before I run out of time. And in St. Cloud, instead of an age-friendly, and I know there's a group over here with this, we're pushing this concept of age flourishing. The idea, asking the question, what do we need to do in our community to promote flourishing across the lifespan? Providing the opportunities to empower, engage, educate, elevate. And elevate is a really interesting concept because we talk about it in psychology. psychology, it's a moral emotion. And I mentioned it earlier, when you see someone doing something really powerfully, emotionally good, morally good, it elevates us. It wants us to replicate that. When we were growing up, we would read those stories about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and they were not necessarily true. That wasn't the point. The point was to elevate us towards more moral behaviors, those moral exemplars in our life. And then the question I have, which is part of this meaning and purpose, is how do we make a difference in general how do we use our strengths, our skills, and our passions to meet a need in the world? So one of the ways we talk about making a difference is to ask ourselves, what are the things that I have as strengths that I can use to make a difference in the world? So I'll tell very quickly about Mel. Mel was in our men's shed. And Mel was a woodworker, but he was retired. He lived alone. Other than the men's shed, Mel really didn't have much going on in his life. And we had somebody come in who happened to be my next door neighbor, talk about foster grandparent program. And she said they need foster grandparents. And Mel's, I'm watching him, he's kind of sort of paying attention. And then they said, we really need teachers, assistants at Apollo High School and North Junior High in St. Cloud in the shop class. His eyes lit up. And so he volunteered, and he would go in and help these kids with the shop class, because you've got one teacher, you've got 25 students, and you've got all this power equipment. Made me a little nervous in that context. But Mel was in there helping these kids do their projects. Mel got as much out of that as any of the students did. In fact, when the holidays would come around, Mel would get depressed because he wouldn't be able to go in and work with the kids. That's a case in point where he had a lifetime of woodworking skills, and there was a need. So I talk about, and I know this was sent out in the advertisement for the presentation, and there are some handouts out here on the table that ask the question, what are your strengths? What do you bring to the table? And there's a very nice survey. This is called the Values in Action. It grew out of the positive psychology. It's the antithesis to the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which we need in order to get reimbursement for mental disorders. But this is the idea that character strengths, come in 6 categories: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, transcendence. And then they cut across all of these different areas: creativity, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, perspective, all fall in that domain of wisdom. And so you can go on this site, takes about 15 minutes, a series of questions, and it will give you these 24 in here in order from your highest to your lowest strength. And then one of the things we do with this, which is kind of interesting when I teach classes on this, we ask people to chart this onto what's called a circumplex model. The circumplex model, all that means is we look at 2 dimensions: mind, heart, others, and myself. And we ask, where are your top 5 or 6 strengths on this? And we ask them to do a highlighter on those areas. Now, I was a university professor. So if you look at these 4 quadrants, where do you think a university professor falls? Yes, you're right, upper right. I'm in my head, and it's about me, right? One of the things I found when I did this is my top 5 or 6 were up in that upper right quadrant. I wasn't real happy about that. My wife goes, well, you shouldn't be. And so what I did is I started asking the question, what are some of the other ones that I want to develop that aren't up there? So gratitude was one, kindness was one. Notice those are down in that lower left quadrant, more of the heart and a concern for others. So one of the things we do when we do this is ask the question, how can I work with my strengths, who I am, to become better at what I do? So we spend time with, I know I'm doing this quickly, we spend time with awareness. In what ways do I manifest the strength? Well, when I was in my professor mode, I was up in that upper right-hand quadrant, and I was happy as a clam up there, because that's where I felt best. When I got down into that lower left quadrant or one of those others, it was a little discomfort. I had to work on being in that area. Do family and friends readily observe it in me? So this is a fun activity. If you choose to do this, be careful. So you go online, you get your 24, it'll give you a printout, it's free, and it'll order them from your top to your bottom, 1st to 24th. But keep in mind, they're all what? I need to seed the audience with the answer to this one. They're all strengths. None of them are deficits. They're all strengths. It's just ranking your highest to your lowest strength based on what you said. So what I'd have students do, and I've had actually teachers at Senior Center in St. Cloud, I would have them take index cards and cut them into fourths. So I need 6 of those, and you would write on each one of those cards one of the character strengths. So one card would have creativity. You get the point. And then you hand it to your partner, your wife, your husband, and ask them to put them in order as she sees you. Remember the cards? And it's really interesting because I'd have people come back and say, well, my number 1 was this, but she had it way down here at number 20. And I say, well, so what does that tell you? And he goes, well, that she doesn't know what she's talking about. I said, no, what it tells you is she doesn't see that strength in you. So ask the question, when you have that in there, what does it mean to be compassionate? What does it mean? Let me go back to him. What does it mean to be prudent? What does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to be honest or to persevere, or kindness or love? What does that actually mean when it manifests? Because apparently she's not seeing it in you. And what does that mean? And then he asked me for a phone number for a marriage counselor. So the idea here is that we can talk about our strengths as a way to meet the needs in the world. And so we explore them, and I want to end with the last one here because we're running out of time, is the application, is to take one of your strengths, not one of the top ones, because more often than not, we're doing the top ones. Take one that's down below. So for instance, apparently, my kindness was fairly low. All evidence to the contrary as far as I was concerned, but it wasn't showing up. So I could set and notice now I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here. I could set a daily intention. Today I'm going to focus on kindness. And I'm going to make it evident. And what does kindness look like for me? What does it look like to be kind in that context? And so set a daily intention to do one of those that are not one of the ones that I'm most comfortable with, to get a little out of my comfort zone. And that's also where we find some creativity in finding creative ways to do that. And then at the end of the day, reflecting on it, how did it go? Now, one of the things we do know about stress is that when we're in stress, we tend to revert back to those habits of mind, that have served us in the past. Not necessarily well, but have served us in the past. So the question is, when times are tough, how can I use this strength I'm working on, like kindness, in ways that will manifest it and people will see it in me, and it'll make a difference in somebody else's life? Stressful times tend not to promote kindness, and tend not to promote compassion. And that's that negative emotion, the fears, those things. We tend to pull inward and find strategies that worked in the past. So finding our strengths allows us opportunities to make a difference for others in the world. All right, I will be out here for a little while if you've got questions. Thank you for your time. I know I covered a lot of material here, and hopefully I've given you some things on that one page to think about. If you're interested, there's a sheet out here that has all the character strengths. You can go online and take your own little test. It's free, and you'll get a printout, and then you can share it with your partner and have fantastic arguments over who's got the better set of character strengths on this. Thank you very much.